This is Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning. Since 2016, we've heard a lot about foreign attempts to interfere in U.S. elections. But in addition to the parts we saw on Facebook and in the media, we continue to see headlines about the same names and investigations, which raises the question, what did it actually look like in the room? Who were the players trying to influence each other? What motivated them? What were those foreign governments actually trying to accomplish? What did they want to see happen in the U.S. and why? Marcy Wheeler is an independent journalist who focuses on national security and civil liberties. We talked to her about all of this, about what we know and what we don't, what we might learn from investigations that are still ongoing, and why it matters. As a reminder, like all of our episodes, this is an edited version of a much longer conversation that was taped live with audience questions. For information on how to join us, past episodes, and more, visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode on Wednesday featuring Thomas Insel, who's a neuroscientist, psychiatrist, entrepreneur, and the former head of the National Institute of Mental Health. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
People are starting to express impatience with the current Department of Justice's inaction, and a lot of it's directed at Merrick Garland. And why haven't they brought charges against Trump or Trump figures? I'm wondering, is that criticism of Merrick Garland and the DOJ's investigations of Trumpworld warranted, or should people calm down a little bit?
Those criticisms partly arise out of the fact that the January 6th investigation is so vast. There are 800 people who've been arrested. On Lisa Monaco's first day in office, Lisa Monaco is the Deputy Attorney General, and she's actually more directly in charge of all of these investigations. On her first full day in office, DOJ approved a warrant for Rudy Giuliani that probably required her involvement. So the first thing she did as Deputy Attorney General was say, we're going to go search Rudy Giuliani. And DOJ spent, at least from the day of that search, so April 28th of last year, until January 21st, trying to obtain the contents of, I think it's 16 devices. Those can be phones and computers and what have you. So DOJ just now is getting records on Rudy Giuliani that DOJ has been trying to get since November 2019.
There were a lot of critiques in the Trump administration about Bill Barr not being an independent player, doing a lot of political favors. I'm wondering, on the converse, how do you view this current DOJ and their ability to successfully separate themselves from political influence? Is it the same as the Trump DOJ, where you have people like Bill Barr, who some consider the worst attorney general ever because he was so involved in the political stuff, or is it something different?
Oh, it's dramatically different. There was an article in the last couple of days by New York Times pointing to the ongoing investigation to Hunter Biden. And there was a lot of complaint about it. And there are reasons to ask about how that article came about, because it almost certainly came about with Rudy Giuliani's involvement. But you know, through the Trump administration, everyone was complaining that Jared Kushner was getting special treatment. Ivanka got special treatment. Don Jr. got special treatment during the Mueller investigation. Donald Trump, of course, got special treatment. And that was all true even before Bill Barr came in. And then Bill Barr made it orders of magnitude worse, intervening in the sentencing of Roger Stone, trying to overturn the investigation of Mike Flynn, altering documents as part of that, and then making sure that Paul Manafort didn't actually serve his prison time in prison before he was pardoned. So, and also interfering in an investigation into Eric Prince. So all of those ways that Barr interfered into ongoing investigations. Meanwhile, there's this investigation into the president's son, and it's just carrying on.
Let's talk about Rudy Giuliani. So Rudy Giuliani's case is an important one because it's so directly connected to the big news story of the year, maybe of the decade, which is the war in Ukraine. The investigation of Rudy Giuliani is very much connected to his activities in Ukraine. It's been months since his offices and apartment were raided. And there hasn't really been that much in the news about where his investigation is at. Just like we were saying, often we don't have transparency into these investigations. So what do we know about the status of Rudy Giuliani's investigation? Can you tell us what you expect that they might be looking for? What kind of crimes are they pursuing? And do we know how far along in the process it might be?
Sure. So the investigation into Giuliani actually started in 2019. It was very closely associated with the Lev Parnas, Igor Fruman investigation. In November of 2019, DOJ got warrants for Rudy's iCloud and another email account, as well as Victoria Tonsig. And then Barr basically shut down the investigation and tried to end the investigation in summer of 2020 by firing the U.S. attorney. He didn't succeed in firing the U.S. attorney, so the investigation continued. One of the things that they would have discovered in getting his iCloud account, and did discover in getting Lev Parnas's iCloud account, is that there were files that were deleted. Presumably, as things moved towards impeachment in 2019, Parnas, we know, deleted files and then got them in discovery because DOJ got a preservation order on them. And he was like, and Parnas has implied that Rudy Giuliani probably also deleted some files along the way. So effectively, DOJ gets files from his iCloud account in 2019 and then gets the same scope of files across these 16 devices in 2021. And the scope of that investigation is actually fairly clear, because when Parnas and Fruman were originally arrested in October of 2019, just as they were about to board a flight to Vienna, they were originally charged with a count pertaining to the firing of Maria Yovanovitch. And remember, she was the ambassador to Ukraine until May 2019, when Rudy basically got her fired on behest of one or multiple Ukrainians who wanted to take her out. And we know who else was targeted in the investigation, and one of those was Yuri Lutsenko, who was a prosecutor in Ukraine. So, and then in 2020, DOJ basically took that charge off of the existing Parnas and Fruman charges and held it, waiting for the moment when they could investigate Rudy Giuliani again. So at a minimum, that's what the investigation pertains to, is how Rudy Giuliani, on behalf of at least one and probably two Ukrainians, succeeded in taking out Maria Yovanovitch, who had been central in American efforts to get rid of corruption in Ukraine.
So, Marcy, you mentioned the effort to fire a U.S. attorney who was overseeing an investigation of Giuliani. Are you referring to Jeffrey Berman from Southern District of New York?
Yeah.
I think that I read somewhere that the case that they were referring to when they pressured him to step down or to move into a different role was that Turkish Halkbank case, which, of course, Giuliani is tangentially related to as well, because he was representing one of the defendants in that case. But do we know if Giuliani's own criminal probe was also, do we know for sure that that was one of the matters that Barr was concerned about when he was speaking to Berman and pressuring him to move away
We
from
can be pretty
SDNY?
certain it was. Berman, when he referenced it, spoke of multiple investigations that were going to continue on. So it's definitely not just the Turkish one. It's other investigations. But we know some of the other things that Barr did to try and stymie the investigation into Giuliani. So, for example, in December of 2019, in the middle of Trump's first impeachment, Rudy Giuliani went and met with this guy, Andrei Derkach, who was then known to be a Russian agent in Ukraine. And he was then looking for dirt about Joe Biden. And early on, when Barr found out about the investigation into Rudy Giuliani, he shut down anything further. He wouldn't let SDNY expand their investigation into Rudy's knowing meeting with a Russian spy, basically, in December of 2019, in the middle of impeachment. And he sent that over to EDNY, to Brooklyn, basically, and made the Brooklyn prosecutor in charge, put the Brooklyn prosecutor in charge of deciding whether or not anybody could investigate Rudy Giuliani. Subsequently, a bunch of things happened. But subsequently, they are conducting an investigation into Derkach in Brooklyn, but the understanding is Rudy isn't allowed to be investigated there. So to some degree, Rudy's lucky that he isn't also being investigated for working on behalf of a known Russian spy, because Bill Barr protected him there. Bill Barr also set up an intake process such that Rudy Giuliani could go to Ukraine to known Russian agents and get dirt on Joe Biden. And it was first taken in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Pittsburgh. And so basically, it was a way to allow Rudy Giuliani to feed dirt from Russian spies into the U.S. justice system. So those are all things we know that Barr did.
It's interesting that these decisions from Barr aren't apparently the sorts of things that interviewers want to ask him about on his television book tour, even though, as we've been saying, many of these incidents are very well documented. They've been in the New York Times, but they're preferring kind of to stick to the script as they're interviewing him on lots of networks.
Rudy Giuliani's former associate Lev Parnas is set to go on trial tomorrow. Federal prosecutors say the Soviet-born Florida businessman was part of a conspiracy to funnel foreign money to U.S. politicians with illegal campaign contributions. Lev Parnas is also accused of using a shell company to disguise a $325,000 donation to a pro-Trump super PAC. Parnas' alleged partner in crime was Igor Fruman. He pleaded guilty last month and admitted to soliciting illegal campaign donations from a Russian national.
The genesis of these charges, all roads lead back to Giuliani and Trump.
Marcy, another person that you mentioned in this chronology of the Giuliani investigation is Lev Parnas. And he's been kind of a strange figure in this, if anyone here remembers Lev Parnas, because he presented himself after he was arrested as being kind of a defector, someone like Michael Cohen who was going to plead guilty, cooperate, and bring evidence against Giuliani and possibly Trump to the Justice Department. But for a long time after that, he didn't do those things. He did not plead guilty. He continued trying to fight the charges. He claimed that he was going to testify for Congress, but the House Intelligence Committee, which was controlled by the Democrats and the chairman, Adam Schiff, did not want him to give them evidence. They didn't seem like they trusted him. What's the status of Lev Parnas right now? Is he someone that we can be looked at as a reliable witness, or is he still pursuing another agenda and fighting some of these charges against him?
So he actually did proffer. When you try and flip, when you try and cooperate, you go to the government and you say, here's the information I would share with you. And the government says, okay, here's the deal we would give you in response. That proffer was in March of 2020. So, not long after impeachment. And the government didn't take him up on it because they wanted him to plead to more charges than he was willing to plead to. And they, I think, rightly still had some questions about his honesty. He had a trial for some of the charges against him in October, was found guilty. This was a different influence peddling scheme where he was giving money, actually Russian money, to pro-cannabis Republicans in the United States, in Nevada and Florida and New Jersey. Found guilty, and he's awaiting sentencing on that. And about a week and a half ago, his attorney filed to say that he wants to plead guilty, but that hasn't been publicly scheduled. So either he has pled guilty and they're hiding it to hide the circumstances of his plea, or they just haven't gotten around to scheduling it yet. So my guess is that that a plea now would involve a cooperation agreement, and would involve a cooperation agreement not just on how he helped to get Marie Yovanovitch fired, but also how he was seeking dirt on Hunter Biden, and also on the attempts to cover this up in fall of 2019. One of the interesting things about the Rudy Giuliani warrant search is that the scope of the warrants for the known investigation only go from May, I think, of 2018 through the end of 2019. And yet DOJ pulled some fast things when they were getting the privilege review done and got the scope of the review from January of 2018. So that would actually include the time when Rudy Giuliani was obstructing the Mueller investigation and through basically the day of the raid. So it would also go through the time of January 6th. And what's interesting about that is the scope of it, therefore, could be far broader than we understand. And we wouldn't know that based on the scope of the privilege review, because DOJ basically got a privilege review of everything that was on his phones.
So Parnas is someone who was born in what is now Ukraine. He was born in Odessa at the time of the Soviet Union. But he's been based in the United States almost his entire life. He's primarily an American citizen and primarily raised in the United States as an English speaker. What kind of interest was he pursuing in Ukraine? How did he get involved in all of this? And what was he really trying to achieve? Was it really just a scheme for him to make money as he was connected with Giuliani and these others? Or was there something else at play here?
I don't think we know the full extent of it. There's also Igor Fruman, also from the area. Igor Fruman clearly had some ties to Russian agents. As I said, the money that they were Fruman pled guilty without cooperating to the Russian money, the cannabis money, before the trial in October. So there was definitely Russian money involved. But when they got on a plane to go to Vienna, they were going to meet Dmitry Firtash. And Victoria Tonsig is involved with that. He's also got ties to Russian mob, Russian intelligence. And so we don't actually know. We know that Russian intelligence was trying to deal dirt on Joe Biden, on Hunter Biden in this time period. And we know that that is one of the things that Parnas and Fruman did. Fruman, I think, had better ties to current Ukrainian society, but basically they were Giuliani's entree into Ukraine. I mean, Giuliani had ties to the mayor of Kiev, Klitschko, actually going back years. So he's been doing business in Ukraine for a while, Rudy has. But these guys were basically his translators, his entree, his fixers, and they would travel with him to Ukraine and go search for this dirt. But Phil Bump at Washington Post did, in the wake of this New York Times article, did a piece about all of the dodgy aspects of the Hunter Biden laptop that is back in the news. And if you look at it, they're like the key events of finding dirt, of Rudy's efforts to find dirt in Ukraine on Hunter Biden, start in December of 2018 and go through May of 2019, the same month that they got Yovanovitch fired. And it's really hard to ignore the possibility that there was some kind of quid pro quo. We get Marie Yovanovitch fired for you, and you give us dirt on Hunter Biden. So, we'll see. We don't know.
And Giuliani's involvement in Ukraine, as you said, it does date back years. But this new initiative, the one that he was pursuing together with Parnas and Fruman and these others, it was also connected partly to Paul Manafort, wasn't it? Because Giuliani was trying to debunk the document that's referred to as the Black Ledger, right? And sort of clear Manafort's name in a way that would influence the way the American public understood the Mueller investigation, right?
Yeah, I mean, and Trump, remember, also wanted, when he was extorting Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, who's now the world hero, right? When he was trying to extort him, he was also trying to say, give us the proof that the hack of the DNC actually came out of Ukraine. And I think people don't understand the degree to which, what Paul Manafort was trying to do, even his campaign strategy in the United States in 2016, was a replay of some of the things that he had used against Viktor Yanukovych's opponents. Manafort was working for, quote unquote, free at the time. He was doing so, he said, because he was going to get paid by these Russian-backed Ukrainian oligarchs, as well as Oleg Deripaska. So basically Russian intelligence paid Paul Manafort to be Trump's campaign manager, but they screwed him over There was this meeting on August 2nd, 2016, where Manafort sat down with this guy, Konstantin Kleptocracy, a Ukrainian Russian citizen, who now the United States says straight out was an intelligence agent, sat down with him and said, here's how we're going to win the election in these swing states. Happened to be, 4 states, 3 of which Trump did end up winning. In exchange, Kleptocracy said, here's how the Ukrainian oligarchs are going to pay you money that you think you're still owed. It was like, I think that was $1.4 million. And then Oleg Deripaska says, you owe him $19 million. Here's how that's going to get paid. And the request from Kleptocracy was that Manafort basically help him carve up Ukraine to Russia's liking. So exactly what we're seeing today. What Russia walked into Ukraine aiming to do, which was sever the eastern part of the country, was what Paul Manafort was supposed to do to get this financial reward that was tied up with Trump winning. I think that people really don't understand the degree to which the 2016 effort, the Russian interference in 2016 to get Trump elected, is of a part with this invasion of Ukraine. They are both an effort to beat back Western hegemony, to beat back democracy, and to replace in the United States, in Ukraine, I mean, Ukraine already was, but to ensure that Ukraine remains a kleptocracy, because kleptocracies are very easy for Russia to manipulate. And that's what Trump was for Russia. It wasn't so much that Trump was ideologically in sync with Russia, with everything, but he was easy to buy, right? They dangled this Trump Tower in Moscow, and then Trump kept pursuing these Russian ties throughout. And I think that was really, they're really a common effort. And the common effort is to impose Russian rule through kleptocracy, both in Ukraine and we could talk about the UK as well. They did it they bought Boris Johnson and bought Brexit in the same year. It was an effort to be able to influence, quote unquote, the West by buying off their leaders.
Well, what we knew going into this is that Oleg Deripaska had at one point invested in a private equity fund that Paul Manafort had tried to launch. But what the AP found here is that the ties go a lot deeper and a lot further back. That Paul Manafort basically was working on behalf of Oleg Deripaska, who is extremely close to Vladimir Putin and the Russian government, to promote both Deripaska's business interests and the Russian government's interests throughout Eastern Europe and former Soviet states. Paul Manafort, definitely spent a number of years as kind of a gun for hire internationally. And what he said he was doing was just sort of straight political consulting work. He was advising Ukrainian political parties. Manafort was both doing that political work while simultaneously and covertly representing a covert foreign influence in both Ukraine and also doing some work that touched on Washington as well. What it does demonstrate is that Paul Manafort had the contacts, connections, and willingness to work for a Russian oligarch who was seeking to influence world events.
You mentioned that Manafort was looking for some kind of financial rewards in his conversations with Kleptocracy, who was hopefully a conduit to Deripaska, who he owed all this money to. And that there was the understanding that maybe he could have some of his debt forgiven if he worked in a way that was beneficial to Deripaska's interests. But as far as we know, in the period of the 2016 election, was there at the time a direct financial link between Manafort and Kleptocracy and Deripaska?
So I said that these people screwed over Manafort, and I believe that. I actually genuinely believe that Manafort was badly underwater, and Russia and these Ukrainian oligarchs used that, exploited that, and then got him fired. At the moment when Manafort had that August 2nd meeting, I'm sure he believed he was going to be the campaign manager through the election, and I'm sure he believed that he was going to win. And I'm sure the understanding was that if he won, then he was going to get this payoff that he expected. He actually told his accountant, I'm going to be paid $1.4 million on November 10th or something like that, 2 days after the election. So that was his expectation. And then immediately after he had that meeting, all of this story about his corruption in Ukraine breaks free. And he gets ousted, and Steve Bannon comes in, and he's the one who actually gets to win the election. And Manafort is screwed. I mean, he's sleazy, he's corrupt. I have no time for Paul Manafort, but I also think that Russia exploited his weaknesses, his vulnerability, in a way that really hasn't been fully appreciated as well.
And even after he was ousted from the campaign, he was accepting bribes or soliciting bribes from bankers in Chicago to try to get positions in the Trump administration, Secretary of the Army, Steve Kalk. Do you remember that case?
Yeah, and that's just, again, he was badly underwater.
Garden variety corruption stuff, not
garden variety corruption. Yeah. The same thing sort of the same thing that Tom Barack was trying to do was to use, everyone did this. It is stunning how many people close to Trump were basically selling access. That's what Mike Flynn was doing with Turkey. He made $500,000 secretly for Turkey while he was getting classified briefings during the campaign. And that was basically, he was victimizing Trump. He was using Trump. George Papadopoulos, same thing. He told an informant that I don't really want to win. I just want to make money off of my access to Donald Trump. Everyone around him was doing that. Everybody. But
and a lot of it was purely domestic. I think it was New York Times did that big investigation about spending at the Trump properties. And one of the people that they linked to this was Tillman Fertitta, the owner of the Houston Rockets, who had been putting millions and millions of dollars into these Trump properties. So it was just across the board corruption. Not all of it was related to these international situations. But I think the ones that we're probably the most concerned about were the ones that were, because it showed that the lack of divestiture, it impacted American national security in such a damaging way.
Right. And the other thing that Paul Manafort continued to do, basically through the time he was arrested, was to pursue these plans. Kleptocracy kept throwing out yet another plan, how to carve up Ukraine. He kept working with Kleptocracy to do basically what Russia is trying to do by force today. And then once he's under investigation, that's when Parnas and Fruman kind of glom on to Rudy Giuliani and become his full-time sidekicks. Manafort knew, and Kleptocracy knew, that Manafort was going to be the campaign manager in 2015. And it's not clear how that works, but that was the plan from very early on. And so from that point until Rudy Giuliani plays a key role in an attempted coup on January 6, 2021, there is no time where one of Trump's most important sidekicks is not heavily being influenced by Russia and Ukraine.
So, Marcy, Paul Manafort has been on an effort to try to rehabilitate his image. And the spin that he's offering is that although he worked for Viktor Yanukovych, his role was always to push Western perspectives on Yanukovych and try to move Yanukovych to a more liberal, Western-facing direction. Is that something that you think has any validity to it, or how would you kind of respond to that?
I think it's important to understand that Paul Manafort brought sleazy campaigning to Ukraine and to a bunch of other places. And so what he brought and what he very critically gave to Yanukovych was the patina of democratic legitimacy after he lost. He was able to come in and say, here's how we're going to rebuild your image. Here's how we're going to game the polls very closely. Here's how we're going to use the justice system to taint your rivals. But I think particularly as we see the assault on democracy in the United States today, by these Republicans who believe there was fraud in the 2020 election, which, by the way, was the plan that Roger Stone was going to chase in 2016. The Stop the Steal organization was created during the 2016 election by Roger Stone. It was just, renewed in 2020 to carry out the very same plan that Roger Stone had in place for if Hillary had won in 2016. But, all of these attacks on voting and on, getting rid of transparency of elections, imposing these QAnon people on local elections, all of that is sort of the continuation of managed democracy, which has which continues to pretend to be a democracy, but eliminates all of the guarantees of actual democracy such that powerful people can stay in place and then basically turn what used to be into democracy into their own fiefdom. That's what I was talking about, that Russia really wants the United States to be a kleptocracy. And under Trump, whether or not Russia got policies from Trump they wanted, Trump accelerated a process that was already going on in the United States in ways that really suited Russia.
How much money did he make in Ukraine, and how exactly did he make it? What was the source of these millions and millions of dollars that Manafort was taking from the country and trying to hide away from American authorities?
Yeah, I don't know that we know all of it, but the amount that he was found to have laundered was something like $36 million. And by the way, because he was pardoned, he was able to keep a chunk of that money, which is just a tremendous scandal that has basically gotten almost no attention. It's unclear exactly where all of the money came from, but the scale was incredible.
And it's interesting that during that 2020 impeachment, again and again, what the Republicans and the defenders of Trump tried to return to was that they were genuinely searching for corruption in Ukraine. And they were able to point at what was, I think we can acknowledge, a very sleazy connection between Joe Biden's son, Hunter, and these Ukrainian business people as a true scandal that they were sincerely concerned about, that they needed to research and find information about. And this was all very sincere anti-corruption concern, that they were worried about corruption in Ukraine. But it is very difficult to accept that, given the attitude that they had towards Paul Manafort, isn't it? When we know for a fact that he had smuggled all of this money out of Ukraine, tried to hide it, and then they made so many efforts to interfere with the investigation into him and then pardoned him. So it's very hard to square that.
Well, and Rudy as well. I mean, I did a post the other day pointing out that of the three people that Ukrainian oligarchs were cultivating to get access to a vice president or a president, at the time that Burisma had hired Hunter Biden, and it is sleazy. Like, this is what I talk about. This is the kind of kleptocracy that Russia wants to encourage in the US and the UK and other places, because that makes it easier for them to basically buy politicians. They had Hunter Biden to get to President Biden, Joe Biden, who was in charge of the Ukraine portfolio under Barack Obama. They had Paul Manafort as the free campaign manager for Donald Trump, with the hopes that when Trump won, he could be the gateway. And there's Rudy Giuliani. And of those three people, only one of them demonstrably succeeded in affecting U.S. policy, and that's Rudy Giuliani, by getting Yovanovitch fired. So after Trump is in office and they want to reelect Trump, they then use the Hunter Biden cultivation that they had done and provided that evidence to try and keep Trump in office, because he was much better for corruption than Joe Biden was, because Biden had made real efforts to force Ukraine to deal with its corruption problem.
It is really worth mentioning that even in the Manafort case itself, this was a bipartisan affair. That Manafort, as a very skilled and experienced lobbyist, understood in order to be effective on Capitol Hill, he needed to have consultants working with him that were Democrats. And so he had Tony Podesta. So he had Greg Craig, who is the the White House counsel in the Obama White House, who was prosecuted. He had Tad Devine, who was the gentleman who wrote the famous America ad for Bernie Sanders, the Simon & Garfunkel ad. He was working with Manafort on the Ukraine file as well. So I think that Americans, no matter who you voted for in any of these elections, should understand that this was a bipartisan, illicit, international influence project, and that there should be bipartisan outrage over what Paul Manafort and these others were pursuing. Is that something, Marcy, that maybe we should emphasize a little bit more, that this isn't really a partisan concern, but it's a genuine public interest concern about corruption?
Yes. And those kinds of people make democracy more vulnerable because you throw enough money at them and you're going to get your influence, you're going to get your policy, you're going to get your connections that you need.
I think something else that's important to note here is that these cases of foreign donations to campaigns, they've been donations to either campaigns proper or to the inauguration fund. But in the post-Citizens United regime, we also have all of the dark money. And we really have no idea how much foreign money is in this space because we can't really investigate or prosecute any of it. And even with a single straw donor, a foreigner could quite easily put millions and millions of dollars of dark money into these PACs without any kind of enforcement. And that's a massive problem.
The U.S. is trying certain things with Russia and Iran and China that they hadn't necessarily tried before. And I think that, Biden and Garland set up this, like, how to go find the money of the oligarchs that's in the United States. And I think that program could be adapted to countries around the world. I mean, the United States is, let's be honest, it's the money laundering haven of the world right now. And Congress did change the law, making it easier to require knowing who's behind a corporation. And I think the urgency of going after Russian oligarchs right now may be this kind of test case in trying to track down where all this money is and how it's influencing policy in the United States.
Well, I think that would be a good opportunity then to bring in a couple audience questions. I see that we've got a couple people who have come up to ask questions. So let's go to Jennifer.
This has been a fascinating conversation. I just wanted to say, as you're kind of discussing buying off politicians or buying access to politicians, as you said, I mean, I did politics in 2000 and it was rampant. I mean, it was unbelievable then. So, but it was corporate interests purchasing it. Now we're seeing it at the nation state level, as you said, and all of these interests and why it's being publicized more on one side than the other, it seems. And I'm wondering if this is, parties not willing to look at themselves, but is it also now are politicians being forced to play to this marketing aspect of their party and themselves versus actually running the country, like to try and stay ahead of this? Does this seem to be a new, direction or practice? Because
look, I mean, yeah, if you want to talk about a corrupt Democrat, you can look at how every time Joe Manchin tanks Joe Biden's policies, he has just met with fossil fuel executives, right? So there clearly is a great deal of that. And if you can just, as fossil fuel interests have done with Joe Biden, if you can just buy off the swing senators, then you can basically throttle policy in DC.
If you look at the examples that you just gave with the purchasing access, the Ukrainians purchasing access either via Hunter Biden, Giuliani, et cetera, it seems like the Hunter Biden was just publicized so much more for no impact versus some of the stuff that's happened during the Trump campaign. Like, my question there would be, why are they so much more effective at publicizing that and keeping American focus on this? Or throwing it out as an issue? Yeah.
Partly because they own Fox News, right? I think that this New York Times article is Rudy Giuliani's effort to distract from what's going on in SDNY. It seems fairly obvious that Rudy Giuliani is much closer to being indicted than Hunter Biden. Maybe they both will be, but certainly, Rudy Giuliani, there's a lot of meat to what's going on with Rudy Giuliani. So it helps if you have a bubble with, 40% of voters in that bubble. And that's what Fox News is. As bad as MSNBC and CNN are, they don't completely hide bad news about Joe Biden the way Fox News literally completely hides information about Trump or whatever Republican is in charge. And I just think that Republicans are also far better at projection than Democrats are, partly because projection is hard. It takes a lot of cynicism to do it well. And I'm not sure there are some Democrats who are good at it. I don't think they're as disciplined as Republicans.
Yeah, I don't think that there's been a significant shortage of coverage of Trumpworld corruption. I think that there's been some great reporting on that topic. We're going to go next to Nas.
Last week, Jared Kushner was in Saudi Arabia, and he get an investment of $3 billion from the Saudi. He met with the Crown Prince. Should that be a subject of at least scrutiny?
It should be. I think he's probably using the Russian war to do that. And look, I mean, the coalition of kleptocrats who backed Trump in 2016, which includes the Saudis, includes the Emirates, includes, there was this allegation that Trump got an infusion of $10 million from Egypt, and the belief was that the money came from somewhere else, but that money kept him afloat in basically September of 2016, and that investigation was killed under Barr as well. And it's clear that the Emirates, especially, and the Saudis, are not interested in helping the United States in their efforts to isolate Russia. In fact, the Emirates just hosted Bashar al-Assad very publicly, as if to say, screw you guys and your efforts to clean up the world. And I think that that's a problem going forward because, Trump's people are happy to be bought off, and Jared Kushner, like Paul Manafort, needs a lot of money to get whole on his debts. And I'm sure the Saudis think he's really easy to buy that way.
This does certainly demonstrate why Trump and the people around him are teasing their interest in running in 2024, even if they don't end up actually doing so, because this is the best way to encourage investment from interested parties abroad, because otherwise it's not a very impressive investment offer that Kushner is carting around over there. So we are going to go to Philip for the next question.
Yeah, so I mean, the Clinton Global Foundation, if you look at the Clinton Foundation, it's very obvious for over 10 years between the time that Bill Clinton was the president to when Hillary was running after the Bush terms that it was very clear that the Clinton Foundation was being used to peddle the exact same type of things you're talking about. The question I'd ask you is, what is the actual real solve on these things? Because obviously you're right, the Justice Department may or may not go after these things if there's interest, and the legislation branch seems not to have any incentive to actually legislate these days. So, I mean, what is the actual incentive going to be to stop corruption? Because it seems like we don't have any formula in place to actually do this.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to apologize for the Clintons at all. And we know, obviously, that there was an investigation into the Clinton Foundation, partly driven by campaign dirt paid for by Steve Bannon, that also had an influence on the election. I mean, that was one of the investigations that was actually disclosed, unlike the ones into Trump. I think that, I will say that the Clinton Foundation actually did do stuff with the money, unlike Trump's foundation, but it's still, I agree, it's about influence peddling. And there are moments when Hillary was Secretary of State where I think that those lines blurred. So I'm not contesting your point. I think that it is there just needs to be a lot more transparency. There also needs to be a lot less money in elections. If you need $1 billion to run for president, you're going to do what you need to do to raise money, and you're going to make, even Obama, who didn't have this background, nevertheless was flying around on, Citibank's jets And then when it came time to prosecute the banks for their corruption, that never happened. And so you need to take a lot of the money out of politics. Yeah.
Marcy, do you have any final thoughts for us before we close down? Anything you want to leave us with?
Yeah, I just think what Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a catastrophe. It is a tragedy. But as we move out of it, I think that the West came so close to the brink. When Putin invaded, he was sure that Republicans were going to vote for him instead of Joe Biden. And there is some of that. I mean, Tucker Carlson clearly is supporting Putin, and a number of other very popular people are as well, and a couple of politicians as well. But it happened far less than Putin thought. Putin believed that he could that he had bought off certain politicians in Europe, and that didn't happen. And I think that whatever else happens coming out of Ukraine, I think if people can begin to think of it as the wake-up call to democracy and to these corruption issues, then I think it may be a lesson. There may be this opportunity to kind of clean things up as we move forward. And so that's my optimistic take out of a really depressing, awful, terrible war in Ukraine.
That's all we have for you today. Again, huge thanks to Marcy Wheeler, to our audience for their questions, and to you for being here. Like all of our episodes, this is an edited version of a much longer conversation that was taped live with audience questions. For information on how to join us and past episodes, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode on Wednesday featuring Thomas Insel, who's a neuroscientist, psychiatrist, entrepreneur, and the former head of the National Institute of Mental Health. This has been Politics and Media 101, produced in partnership with Clubhouse. I'm Jeff Browning, on behalf of Justin Higgins, our co-founder, and our team. Thank you very much for being here. We hope to see you and hear from you soon.